to that later. But joining us now are Anand Samy and Natasha Srdoc from their co-host of America's Roundtable. How are you guys doing today?
It's great to be with you, Gerard. Thank you so much for the kind invitation to joining you all at SuperTalk, Mississippi.
Thank you, Gerard, for having us.
You bet. Always a pleasure having you guys on. So I know we've got this situation brewing across the pond there with respect to Russia and the Ukraine, and it just seems like Vladimir Putin is he's really feeling his oats here. I think he senses weakness with our president, and even though the administration has insisted that what took place in Afghanistan several months ago has no bearing or is not a factor in what President Putin is perhaps going to do with respect to Ukraine. I got to believe it does. I know you guys know a whole lot about this. Help us understand what's happening here.
Well, Gerard, you are absolutely right. There have been significant missteps and also blunders, at times reckless behavior, conduct on the part of President Vladimir Putin. But at the same time, we're in the West, and specifically the United States of America, has sent wrong signals or mixed messages. Our hastily, as well as our chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, showed weakness not only to Russia, but to China and Iran as well. And as we saw just a few days ago, China and Russia had joint naval exercises in the Arabian Sea. We would not have thought about that a year, 2, 3 years ago. And certainly this is a serious problem. But even a greater problem is that NATO, which was a military alliance created right after the Second World War, was supposed to be a defensive measure against the Soviet Union. And President Trump also communicated his concerns by saying that NATO was obsolete. Its mission at that time was certainly a principled one. But now we have a number of Eastern European countries that are NATO members whose judicial independence is worse than Russia. In fact, you have Croatia, you have Ukraine. Their judicial independence ranking in the World Economic Forum's annual survey is worse than Vladimir Putin's Russia. So we're certainly not sending the right signals to Eastern Europeans, to Europe. And we also see that Europe is divided, with Germany on one side, receiving quite a bit of gas supplies from Russia, some 50% dependency on Russian gas.
Yeah, it's at the end of the day, Joel, doesn't it seem like that's really what's at the heart of this and what is causing our European allies, such as Germany, to really walk very softly around this issue?
Right. And that is actually our complicity of the West with what was going on in Eastern Europe. Basically, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a legacy of communism that still persists today. And that is the disregard for private property rights and institutionalized power taken over by networks of corrupt government leaders together with the private partners in crime. So that when you look at Eastern Europe, most of the assets that were previously state-owned through communism became private assets of tycoons, oligarchs, of people, most corrupt people in those countries that were connected to the governments. Yeah. So we have Putin that just passed constitutional amendment that wants to stay in power forever. Same happened in China. In Ukraine, we had oligarchs who were laundering money through U.S., Liechtenstein, Switzerland, Austria, and they were caught in U.S. because of the FBI that went after them. So they confiscated and frozen assets. And the problem in Europe is that they haven't had that rigorous sanctions as U.S. did at the time in 2009 and 10, 20 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So we continue to see all of that money coming from Russia and Ukraine laundered in London as a city, a banking center of Europe, and Germany getting 50% of its gas supplies. So they benefit from Russia. So these, Britain and Germany benefit from Russian oligarchs doing business with them. Gazprom, obviously, is also had some secret ownership, it's alleged, to the Kremlin's government officials. And so we have a problem. We can't, we want to put sanctions, but then who benefits from it? So who's going to be hurt? And we are not all on the same side when it comes to real principle solutions, because the principal solution would be to establish the rule of law, to insist on it 30 years ago, basically. And, we have Andrei Ilarianov, who was a former chief economic advisor to President Putin, that was on the board of our Adriatic Institute while we were very active in Eastern Europe. And he shared with us, actually, he said, if you want to choose between the rule of law and favorable business environment, and you cannot have both, what would you choose? And that was, for the Westerners, it was a nonsense, like a contradictory nonsense. You can't have a favorable business environment without the rule of law. But that's what happens, and what it allows it to happen is corruption. So that's actually a major problem that we have with Russia, Ukraine, and seeping into our systems, U.S. included. We are not immune to it.
Yeah, and we have a president in this country that is just determined to completely eliminate and eradicate use of fossil fuels and for future development of our fossil fuels resources. Seems to me like this is the time when we ought to be thinking about ratcheting that up so as to protect our interests domestically. Aren't we putting ourselves at tremendous risk by doing so?
Absolutely, Gerard. In fact, cutting off the XL pipeline and then driving our allies into Russians' hands to depend upon Russia for energy.
Right.
30% of the European Union depends on Russian gas. And as Natasha Srdoc mentioned just a moment ago, Germany receives 50% of its gas from Russia. So instead of trying to be energy independent in America and exporting energy, either gas supplies or other fossil fuels, we have basically limited our potential and also weakened the Western alliance. And energy is a crucial element to it all. And so therefore, bad actors like Russia, others are going to be emboldened because we're driving customers to the bad people to actually be more enriched. So it's really not a win-win situation. And the Biden administration's policies have put us at great risk, unfortunately.
Yeah, it makes no sense. We got a couple of minutes here, but I wanted to ask you this question, and you alluded to it, Joel, is it seems like this axis of power is emerging where you've got North Korea, Iran, Russia, to some extent China. They seem to be working side by side, combining assets and resources. This is disturbing. Should we be worried about this?
Indeed, it should be a great concern for the United States, for the West, to see China and Russia, in a sense, working together to undermine the rule of law, the international order, if you want to call it, where the rule of law system and free markets ought to be prosperous. But what we see here, just as we talked about earlier, is the fact that China is actually encouraging Russia in its efforts. It's not going against Russia in what it's doing by amassing all these troops around Ukraine. It is supportive of Russia. And then what we see now is that the stars of the Olympics in just a few days will be, of course, China's President Xi Jinping, as well as Vladimir Putin from Russia. And we made a number of mistakes in the West. What we should have done is actually brought Russia into the orbit. And by engaging in important rule of law reforms, focusing on market reforms for Russia, there was a time where we could have done it. But instead, as Natasha alluded to earlier, we were more interested in getting that money into our financial systems and look the other way.
Unbelievable. All right, we got a break right here. Hopefully you guys can stick with us. I want to get your thoughts on what action we should be taking to address this issue. And then, as part of the next segment, talk about some stuff that's going on domestically in Washington with respect to how Americans feel about their present situation. And we'll be right back here on Midday. Joel and Anand Samy and Natasha Srdoc are our guests. They are host of America's Roundtable radio program and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. We're just talking about the Ukraine and Russia situation that appears to be reaching a boiling point. What do you guys think the United States should be doing now? What policy positions should the Biden administration be implementing? What policies, I should say, to try to take the sizzle out of this deal and really just decompress it?
Right. I think that sanctions, economic and financial sanctions, should be a threat that will really crumble the tycoon and oligarchs connected to Kremlin's government apparatus. So I think if they see that as a threat, if they see that their assets will be frozen, their family's assets, their friends, anyone that they are connected to, because many times they're using fictitious name, family members, and other friends to just hide the ownership of those assets. If that could be done in the U.S. and also work with the U.K., because most of Russian investment is in the U.K. So I think that would be the best thing to do, because we have a two-layered approach here. We have people that are suffering actually, because in China, in Russia, in Ukraine, you have average people that don't want war. They don't want communism. They are just living in poverty because of tycoons that just stole the assets of the country. So we have to somehow do something that will address the problem of tycoons and government structures that have to stop, because they will be hurt. I mean, they don't want this to happen, and I think that should be done in a very resolute manner, with all countries coming together. Even if Germany, which is reluctant at this stage with the Nord Stream pipeline because of 50% of gas coming from Russia to Germany, I think it will be helpful to impose all other sanctions, and Germany will follow eventually. But we do need to do something. Otherwise, we don't want a disaster to happen with potential war.
And if I'm not mistaken, well, just going to ask you this before you get to that, Joel, is it not true that Germany has also taken offline their nuclear power plants, and they've also dramatically eliminated or reduced their coal-burning plants as well? So they're even more dependent on Russia and Russian oil for their energies to power the country.
Right.
And that's exactly what emboldens Vladimir Putin, because he knows that there really isn't any serious leverage that the West has when the European Union's largest power, Germany, is depending upon the energy coming from Russia. And unfortunately, Chancellor Merkel lost an opportunity by certainly shoring up their energy reserves and energy independence. They scrapped the notion of building nuclear plants and depending more on Russian gas. And that's the same for countries like Hungary. Just today, Hungary's Prime Minister Orban made a special trip to Moscow to work out a special deal between Hungary and Russia to make sure that Hungary had more gas supplies. And of course, with the blessing of Putin, he said, of course, we'll help you. And then in return, Orban said, which is a NATO member, Hungary, we have to remember, is a NATO member, said, you've got my full support. So we have a divided NATO, a divided European Union, and we've got a weakened Biden administration. So that doesn't bode well. We certainly need to fix these problems, as Natasha Srdoc has communicated, economic sanctions, looking at the dollar license that will truly affect the Russian oligarchs.
You know, it just seems like that this is just right up Putin's alley, right? He's just reveling in every second of this, the power-hungry authoritarian that he is. He's got to be loving this.
Absolutely. When you think about what has happened, it truly is. Go right ahead. Yeah.
That's just scary.
He was a former KBG official, and so and he actually, a number of political opponents ended up in jail or killed. I mean, Russians are known to kill their opponents or or spies, even abroad. Like a case in Britain where they actually use a nerve kind of agent to kill two people, but they were not they didn't succeed. But I mean, they're able to do a lot of damage, which we should not allow to happen. Yeah.
Natasha, is it true now? Do you come from the region?
I come from Croatia. Croatia was part of Yugoslavia, and Yugoslavia was a part of non-aligned movement in between the West and the Warsaw Pact on the East. But I do understand the realities, because the same things happen and still happen in Croatia, that this institutionalized power by corrupt network, it's actually kind of a mafia state where government pulls triggers. It's connected to the crime and money laundering. And basically, the problem is that the pressure must have come from the West, and there should not be any complicity, because complicity allowed from the West allows it to continue. And then we actually import corruption to the United States because of having these people here in our midst, or funding our lobbyists in Washington, D.C., or think tanks, and media sometimes. So it becomes a complex issue that has to be approached from a principle solution point of view, so that you have to, we need to believe in certain things and to start cleaning it up.
I have seen a video interview this past weekend of one of the mayors, a mayor of one of the cities in Ukraine, and talking about just the citizens, the townspeople, literally prepping for war and going through various exercises and maneuvers to just defend themselves and their families and their property. This is hard to believe it's happening in this world, amongst these civilized nations, if you will, today. This is scary when you see this.
In fact, it is, and it should be, as I believe some of the Pentagon officials have mentioned, it will be horrifying to see this war erupt in Ukraine. And we have to understand that this all began in 2014 when President Obama was in power. And so this is not just a new invasion. Vladimir Putin already initiated it, but we don't have to look too far behind. We saw what happened in the Balkans. Natasha is from the former Yugoslavia. What happened in that region when 200,000 people were killed in the 1990s, not too far away, not too far back. And to see something like that happen in Ukraine would be disastrous. The humanitarian crisis that would unfold. There's just such significant risk for the West, for Europe, and for the United States. We already know what it is to spend $14 trillion in an Afghanistan setting, and we lost the war after 20 years, and we just don't want to be getting into another quagmire without really looking at principled solutions, without having to go to war.
Totally agree. We got a couple of minutes left, but there are reports surfacing now that are related to this transport of those crossing our borders illegally under the cover of darkness into American cities on taxpayer-funded charter jets is mind-boggling. But now there are reports surfacing that there are individuals amongst those that are being transported coming across the border that are coming from Russia, that are coming from that area of the world, and not just as Americans thought, though they're just coming from Guatemala or the like, seeking a better life or asylum and so forth. Your thoughts about that?
Right. I mean, that's the whole, the crux of the issue is that we have authoritarian regimes that are starving their people, killing their people, or mafia states, and the people are fleeing those places, and they're coming to the U.S., among other countries. So in order to remedy this issue, we need to make sure that, the authoritarians such as Putin, such as Xi Jinping, and other, regimes that are in Latin America are addressed in a way that they are, the regimes have to be starved in a way. So it has to be, there must be some kind of sanctions imposed that will freeze the assets, that will, make sure that those people cannot continue the way they're doing things. And I think we have to lead the way. U.S. has to lead the way together with our European allies, but we need to make sure that they're not complicit in those schemes.
It's ironic when you think about it that here we are in a situation 5, 6, 7,000 miles away. We're concerned about the Ukraine-Russia border, but not doing anything about the U.S. southern border. So we have to get our priorities straight as well.
It's nuts. Guys, always a pleasure having you, Joel. Natasha, I'm sure we'll be talking to you soon, and we'll be tracking this issue. I know you guys will as well. You're always great to have on the show. Appreciate your insight. We'll talk to you soon.
Great. Thank you so much indeed, Gerard. Thank you for your leadership.
You got it. Middays will be right back. Stay with